There is a city buried in the American desert that nobody officially talks about. A city that was engineered with the precision of a space observatory, connected by roads so perfectly straight they defy natural logic. And then, without warning, without explanation, completely and utterly emptied. The people who built it did not die there. They simply walked away. Archaeologists have been digging through this silence for over a century, and what they have found is not a mystery. What they have found is something far darker. A story of engineered power, calculated terror, and a civilization that destroyed itself from the inside. Something is deeply wrong with the story you were told about the Anasazi. You were probably taught that they vanished, that one of the most sophisticated civilizations ever to rise in North America simply blinked out of existence sometime around 1300 CE, leaving behind their cliff cities, their pottery, their roads, their astronomical temples, and nothing else. No bones, no mass graves, no clear evidence of invasion, just empty buildings, cooling hearths, and a silence so complete it has haunted archaeologists for over 100 years. The textbooks call it a disappearance, a mystery, one of prehistory's great unsolved puzzles. But here's the problem with that story. It is not the truth. What archaeologists have actually uncovered, through decades of tree ring analysis, isotopic bone studies, satellite-mapped road systems, and forensic excavation, is something far more disturbing, far more human, and in many ways far more relevant to the world we live in right now. The Anasazi did not disappear into thin air. They were pushed, they were broken, and the system that broke them was one they themselves had built, a system of unequal power, ritual violence, environmental destruction, and a ruling elite so insulated from the consequences of their own decisions that by the time the collapse came, there was nothing left to save. This is not ancient history. This is a blueprint. Let us start at the beginning, not with the collapse, but with the rise, because you cannot understand how something falls until you understand how high it was built. Approximately 2,000 years ago, in the region where the modern American states of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico converge, a place now called the Four Corners, a people began to emerge from the desert floor. They were not nomads stumbling through sand. They were architects, astronomers, engineers, and farmers who had learned to read the land with a precision that would not emerge again in North America for centuries. They planted corn, beans, and squash in irrigated terraced fields. They developed pottery traditions of extraordinary delicacy. They built underground ceremonial chambers called kivas, round and semi-subterranean, aligned to the stars. They organized themselves into communities that grew larger and more sophisticated with every generation. By around 900 CE, they had begun building something that would become one of the most remarkable urban centers in the ancient world, Chaco Canyon, a complex in what is now northwestern New Mexico. And this is where the story gets complicated. Because Chaco Canyon was not simply a city, it was something more deliberate than that, something almost impossibly ambitious for its time. Think about the scale for a moment. At its heart sat Pueblo Bonito, a structure 4 stories tall, shaped like a giant crescent moon, containing over 600 rooms, multiple plazas, and dozens of kivas. It stood as the largest building in North America until the 19th century. Let that register. The structure, built without metal tools, without wheeled transport, without draft animals, in the middle of a high desert canyon that receives fewer than 9 inches of rain per year, was the architectural apex of an entire continent for nearly 800 years. But here is what nobody talks about when they describe Pueblo Bonito. To build it, the Chacons imported over 200,000 large timber beams, pine, spruce, and fir, hauled entirely on human backs from forests located between 40 and 80 miles away. There were no trees in Chaco Canyon. There were no trees for miles. And yet they chose this specific, inhospitable, resource-poor location to build their greatest monument. The question that haunts researchers is not how they built it. The question is, why here? Why in a canyon with almost no water, no forests, no natural agricultural advantage? Why did an entire civilization center itself in the most difficult place possible? The answer, according to informed sources in the archaeological record, is power. Chaco was not built for survival. It was built for control. The astronomical alignments at Chaco Canyon are so precise that modern researchers continue to find new ones. Pueblo Bonito is aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that rivals purpose-built observatories. On the morning of the winter solstice, the rising sun strikes specific interior windows and illuminates corner niches in ways that could not be accidental. The Great Kiva of Casa Rinconada, a massive circular ceremonial chamber, is designed so that on the summer solstice, a beam of sunlight enters through a specific window and strikes a specific wall niche at the exact moment of sunrise, and then never again for an entire year. The roads, those staggeringly engineered roads, radiate outward from Chaco in perfectly straight lines, some of them 30 feet wide and stretching over 60 miles through canyons, over mesas, cutting through obstacles with a geometric rigidity that defies any utilitarian explanation. And this is where everything changes. Those roads were not for commerce, they were not trade routes. Archaeologists have determined that many of them lead nowhere useful. No agricultural centers, no water sources, no population hubs. The Great North Road runs for 35 miles in an almost perfect straight line pointing due north, ending near the edge of a geological formation, not a city. Researchers now believe these roads were ceremonial, spirit paths, cosmographic statements, engineered expressions of cosmological belief. They were not roads for the living, they were roads for something else entirely. The evidence for a ruling elite at Chaco Canyon is now overwhelming. Penis research has established that significant social differentiation, a structured hierarchy of wealth, status, and power, began at Chaco approximately 150 to 200 years earlier than previously believed. The researchers found that this inequality was deliberately sanctified through the linking of elite bloodlines to cosmological forces. In plain terms, the ruling class told the people that their power came from the stars. And the stars, as engineered by Chaco's architects, appeared to agree. But there is something even stranger buried in the elite tombs of Pueblo Bonito. In 2016, a team examining the burial crypts beneath the Great House made a discovery that stopped the academic world in its tracks. The ruling elite of Chaco Canyon had 6 fingers and 6 toes. Polydactyly, the condition of having extra digits, was not just present among Chaco's rulers, it was apparently revered. Researchers found that people with 6 toes were disproportionately associated with the most important ritual structures and the most prestigious high-status objects, including massive collections of turquoise that formed the economic backbone of the entire regional trade network. Read that again. The people with extra toes were buried with the greatest wealth in the most sacred spaces, surrounded by ritual significance. This was not coincidence. This was a dynasty, a genetic lineage that had successfully transformed a physical anomaly into divine legitimacy. If your rulers have 6 toes and claim the power of the stars, and if the stars themselves have been architecturally engineered to validate that claim, then what do? You obey. You bring tribute. You carry timber 80 miles through the desert on your back because the celestial clock says it must be so. The real story is that the Anasazi did not live in the egalitarian hunter-gatherer paradise that early Romantic archaeology once imagined. They lived in a system of enforced hierarchy, ritual obligation, and increasingly unsustainable extraction. And that system was going to break. The only question was when and what the breaking would look like. The breaking began with the trees. To construct Chaco Canyon's great houses and to fuel its ceremonial fires, the Chacoans systematically deforested the surrounding landscape. Researchers estimate that over the course of Chaco's construction boom, which peaked between 1050 and 1100 CE, more than 200,000 trees were removed from the surrounding plateau and canyon systems. Deforestation at that scale does not simply remove wood. It removes the root systems that hold topsoil in place. It eliminates the forest canopy that moderates moisture retention. It accelerates erosion and reduces the capacity of the land to absorb and hold what little rainfall exists. In a high desert where water was already the scarcest resource, the Chacoans had systematically destroyed the landscape's natural capacity to support them. But here is where it gets worse. They were doing this during one of the climatically favorable periods in southwestern history. Tree ring research from the University of Arizona's Laboratory of Tree Ring Research shows that the peak construction boom at Chaco Canyon coincided with an unusually active sun, a stronger monsoon cycle, and elevated water tables across the southern Colorado Plateau, conditions that made the desert briefly bloom. During this window, Chaco flourished, population grew, the great houses rose, the roads extended, the astronomical temples were refined. The turquoise trade network expanded across hundreds of miles, pulling in goods from as far as the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific coast. The Chacoans built their empire on a climate anomaly. And then the anomaly ended. Construction of great houses in Chaco Canyon ceased around 1130 CE. This is not a coincidence. This date corresponds precisely with the beginning of one of the most devastating droughts in the region's history. Researchers from the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research created a record of Colorado River flow extending back before 800 AD, which shows an extreme drought persisting 62 years from 1118 to 1179 CE. And the last known inhabitants of the complex Chaco Canyon civilization disappeared during this same interval, 62 years. Think about what that means. Not one drought season, not a bad decade. 62 consecutive years of below normal precipitation, declining water tables, and failed harvests in a landscape that had already been stripped of its forests and its topsoil by a century of intensive resource extraction. And, according to informed sources in the archaeological record, this was not even the worst of it. Tree ring rings from a 25-year period from 1275 to 1300 CE were described by pioneering researcher Andrew Ellicott Douglas as very, very narrow and consistently narrow, a signature of extreme, sustained drought unlike anything seen before or since in the region. This event, now known as the Great Drought, is the period most directly associated with the final abandonment of the great Anasazi settlements, Mesa Verde, the cliff cities of Colorado, the remaining communities of the Four Corners region. Prolonged megadroughts, like the Great Drought of 1276 to 1299 CE, coincide with widespread abandonment of large Four Corners settlements and severe maize shortfalls. But here is what mainstream accounts consistently understate. The drought did not simply empty the granaries, it detonated the social contract. When you have built your entire civilization around a priestly elite whose power rests on their ability to predict and command the celestial order, when the rituals they perform, the alignments they control, the astronomical calendar they manage all promise agricultural abundance in exchange for tribute and obedience. And then the rains stop for 25 years. Something catastrophic happens to belief, not just to agriculture, to belief. The celestial clock that the elite had spent generations engineering as proof of their divine authority had failed, visibly and catastrophically, in front of everyone. At the Four Corners area, a number of sites offer strong evidence of cannibalism. Human bones disarticulated, cut, burned, and cast about in exactly the same fashion as the bones of animals known to have been used for food. At the Cowboy Wash site specifically, researchers found the remains of 7 men, women, and adolescents, apparently massacre victims whose bodies had been systematically butchered. But it was what they found in the fire pit that changed everything. A coprolite, preserved human feces, found in a fire pit at the site was tested and found to contain human myoglobin, a protein found exclusively in human muscle tissue. As researcher Richard Marler stated, "All we have found from the Cowboy Wash samples is human myoglobin, no other species. They had a human meat meal. This was not survival cannibalism. This was not a desperate act of isolated starvation." The archaeological pattern at Cowboy Wash, and at dozens of other sites across the Four Corners, tells a very specific story. Researchers noted a sharp increase in evidence of cannibalism between 1130 and 1150 CE, followed in each case by the abandonment of the site, then a decrease in the early 1200s as the climate improved. The cannibalism follows the drought. The abandonment follows the cannibalism. This is a sequence. This is cause and effect playing out across an entire civilization. University of Arizona physical anthropologist Christy Turner and his late wife Jacqueline spent nearly 30 years studying human bones from Anasazi sites across the Four Corners, including Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, and dozens of less famous locations. The pattern they found was not the familiar park ranger story of peaceful farmers. Instead, the bones revealed signs of violent death, warfare, and cannibalism. They examined 76 Anasazi sites across New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Utah, most of which exhibit signs of cannibalism, not isolated survival cannibalism, but systematic ritual activity of the type common in Mesoamerica. What most people are not seeing is the strategic dimension of this violence. Some researchers have proposed that this was not internal collapse, that it was enforced, that a small, organized force, possibly connected to the militarized religious cultures of Mesoamerica, had inserted itself into the Chaco system and was using ritual violence as a tool of terror and control. It becomes possible to imagine an overbearing class of leaders who used cannibalism and violence to coerce the surrounding communities into providing food and laborers for their frenzied public works programs in Chaco Canyon, combined with climate change that reduced the surplus calories farmers could provide, creating a volatile cultural environment. This is not chaos. This is strategy. Terror, when deployed by a ruling elite facing the collapse of its legitimacy, becomes a substitute for authority. If the gods have stopped responding to ritual, then perhaps fear will do what reverence no longer can. If the harvest prayers no longer work, then perhaps the people can be kept in place through something more visceral than ceremony. The slash marks on the bones at Castle Rock, at Cowboy Wash, at the site designated 5MT110 near Mesa Verde. These are not the marks of starving people. Archaeologists excavating Castle Rock in Colorado found evidence of dismemberment, torture, and cannibalism. These are the marks of power asserting itself through violence because every other mechanism of control had already failed. And then came the final factor, the one that sealed everything. By the late 1200s, the social architecture of the Anasazi world was catastrophically unbalanced. The great houses of Chaco had consumed the region's timber. The megadrought had consumed the region's water. The ruling elite, the polydactyl dynasty, the celestial engineers, the turquoise trade controllers, had consumed the population's surplus labor for over 2 centuries. When a culture has more rich people to support than poor people to sustain them, then the whole system collapses for everyone. This is not a modern observation. This is the pattern that archaeological evidence has now confirmed was operating in the Four Corners region by the late 13th century. The extraction had exceeded the capacity of the land and the people to provide, and so they left. Not as a single dramatic event, not as a sudden flight in the face of an invading army, or a single catastrophic flood, but in a long, grinding community-by-community dissolution, a slow unraveling of everything that had held the system together as family by family, settlement by settlement. The people of the Four Corners packed what remained of their lives and walked south and east toward the Rio Grande, toward the Hopi Mesas, toward the valleys of Arizona where water still existed and memory had not yet curdled into terror. The Ancestral Puebloans did not vanish. They migrated and evolved into today's Pueblo peoples. The narrative of a vanished civilization is a romanticized myth. The Hopi, the Zuni, the modern Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande. These are not the descendants of a civilization that disappeared. They are the civilization. Reorganized, relocated, transformed, but continuous. Their oral traditions carry the memory of the migration. Modern Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi and Zuni, maintain oral histories that echo the Anasazi story. Stories of ancestors migrating due to drought and conflict, with continuity in agricultural practices and ceremonies. But the cities were left behind. And this is where the story becomes something more than ancient history. Chaco Canyon sits today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected by the United States government, studied by researchers from dozens of institutions, photographed by tourists who drive hours through the New Mexico desert to stand in the shadow of Pueblo Bonito and feel the weight of what was built here. What most of those tourists do not understand, what the interpretive signs do not fully explain, is that what they are standing in is not a ruin. It is a warning. Every element of the Anasazi collapse follows a pattern that historians of civilizational failure recognize immediately. A resource extraction economy that grows faster than the environment can sustain. An elite class that insulates itself from the consequences of its own decisions through ideology, in this case cosmological ritual, while the costs of their ambition cascade downward onto those least able to absorb them. An environmental degradation process, deforestation, soil erosion, water table collapse, that operates slowly enough that no single generation experiences it as a crisis, but quickly enough that within 3 or 4 generations, the landscape is fundamentally altered. And finally, when crisis does arrive, a response from the powerful that involves not reform but coercion, not adaptation but enforcement, not sharing but extraction redoubled. Resource depletion, overexploitation of local resources such as deforestation and soil degradation, may have exacerbated the impact of drought. The Anasazi's reliance on maize, which requires substantial water, would have made them particularly vulnerable to environmental stress. But the drought alone did not collapse the civilization. The drought was the final pressure applied to a system that had already been made brittle by inequality and extraction. The drought cracked the glass. The glass had been thinning for a century. And here's the dimension of this story that should arrest your attention entirely. As one lead researcher put it, these are droughts so far beyond contemporary experience that they are almost impossible to think about. The Anasazi thought their celestial engineers could manage the relationship between civilization and climate. They built an entire architecture of power around that premise. They aligned their great houses to the sun. They engineered their roads toward the horizon. They demanded tribute and labor and obedience in the name of a cosmic order they claimed to understand. And for a while, for a remarkable, brilliant, architecturally astonishing while, it worked. And then the rain stopped. Scientists shifted from viewing the Ancestral Puebloans' departure as a mysterious disappearance to a deliberate migration triggered by a combination of environmental and social factors. In short, highly climate-sensitive dryland agriculture, local deforestation and soil loss, and repeated multi-year droughts, combined with social pressures all combined to make life untenable in the Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon regions. But what no scientific paper fully captures, what the dry language of dendrochronology and isotopic analysis cannot quite convey, is what it must have felt like to be the last family in a city of 600 rooms, to stand at the edge of Pueblo Bonito, 4 stories of engineered stone rising behind you, and realize that the water is gone, the trees are gone, the trade routes are silent, your neighbors left last season, and the priests who promised you cosmic order have either fled or turned violent. To look at the Great North Road stretching perfectly straight toward the northern horizon and understand that the only useful thing left about it is the direction it points, away. The Anasazi collapse was not a mystery. It was a process, a recognizable, traceable human process of overshoot and disintegration, visible in the bones and the tree rings and the burned kivas and the perfectly straight roads that lead to the edge of everything. What the archaeologists are still uncovering in new excavations and new isotopic analyses and satellite mapping of road systems that extend further than anyone previously understood, in genetic studies linking modern Pueblo peoples to specific Chacoan lineages, is not the answer to the mystery. It is the depth of the warning. Because the civilization did not fail suddenly, it failed slowly and then catastrophically, the way all civilizations that outgrow their foundations eventually do. And the most chilling detail in the entire archaeological record is not the butchered bones at Cowboy Wash, or the six-toed dynasty in the crypts beneath Pueblo Bonito, or the 62-year drought that silenced the greatest city in North America. The most chilling detail is this. The construction at Chaco Canyon did not slow gradually as the pressure mounted. Despite the mid-1100s megadrought having significant cultural impacts due to its duration, intensity, and persistence, relatively little attention has been paid to its cultural impact. And the period coincides precisely with the decline and reorganization of the Chaco regional system. Construction of great houses ceased by 1130 CE. Right up until the moment of collapse, the system was building. Right up until the moment the drought made everything untenable, the elite were commissioning new structures, demanding new timber, extending the roads, performing the astronomical ceremonies, asserting the divine order. They did not see it coming. Or, more accurately, someone saw it coming and kept building anyway. And the people who carried the timber on their backs, who grew the corn in the drying fields, who watched the water table drop season by season, those people eventually made a different calculation. They walked away. They left behind the great houses and the kivas and the roads and the dynasty and the cosmic authority and the six-toed bones and the crypts. And they went south, and they survived, and their descendants are alive today. The real question, the one that neither the archaeologists nor the oral historians nor the climate scientists have fully answered, is not why the Anasazi left Chaco. It is what they carried with them when they went. What knowledge? What memory? What understanding of what happens when a system built on extraction and cosmic ideology meets the reality of a landscape that has finally, irrevocably, run out? Because that knowledge, the hard, bone-level knowledge of what civilization-scale collapse actually feels like from the inside, is perhaps the most valuable thing the Ancestral Puebloans left behind. More valuable than the astronomy, more valuable than the architecture, more valuable than the turquoise. The question is whether anyone, anywhere in the world they walked into, or the world we inhabit now, is actually listening to it